I mean, just this year, the FAA received 394 reports of unruly passengers. I remind you, I said this year, and it is only February, right? In most cases, the beefs were, well, they were over masks. That's got people from the CEO of Delta to the transportation secretary talking about adding those who get out of hand on a flight to the no-fly list. A group of Republican senators, well, they opposed that. And in a letter to the attorney general, they said that that would equate Americans skeptical of mask rules to terrorists. Keep in mind, about 1 in 5 flight attendants say they were involved in a physical incident with a passenger just last year. Let's bring in two to discuss from different perspectives as well, security and political in different worlds, the Juliette Kayyem and Scott Jennings. I gave you the Juliette Kayyem. I'll give you the Scott Jennings as well. I don't want to leave any of that off for both of you, but now you are both here. Let me begin with you, Juliette, because it's so important to lean on your expertise, in particular on this issue and with Homeland Security related. What is your thought about the idea of equating people who are unruly based on the mask mandates, et cetera, with perceived terrorists? What's your thought?
So unruly is a really nice way of putting disruptive and dangerous. I mean, unruly makes them sound like they're playing their music too loud. But what we're seeing in a lot of these instances is essentially criminal behavior and a dangerous instrument that if things go wrong on an airplane, they actually can go terribly, terribly wrong. And so I just want to make it clear, the no-fly list is about disruptive or dangerous airport behavior. It started off or was triggered by, of course, the terrorist attacks of 9/11, but that's like acting like nothing has changed in terms of our threat environment for the last 20 years. Anyone in Homeland Security knows, Homeland Security isn't about stopping, 19 terrorists from getting on 4 airplanes anymore. It's about all the risks that Americans face, whether it's climate or violent people on airplanes or a pandemic, and lowering that risk. So it would be totally appropriate to have a floor that simply says, if you do something disruptive like this, right? In other words, something of a magnitude of a degree, and we can define it, that was disruptive, right? Yeah. Then you cannot fly on any airplane, because the only remedy we have now is one airline takes them off their list or a criminal remedy. There has to be something in between to actually tell people you cannot behave this way. It will motivate others to behave better. So rowdy, I think, is just an easy way out for these Republicans to not support it.
I hear you. And on that point, the idea of defining it, that sticks in my mind, Scott, and I want to invite you into the conversation because the first thought, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, the first thought is, well, how are maybe passengers or flight marshals or others to determine whether this is a passenger who is, as the word unruly, or somebody who could pose a threat to embolden others to then use a pretextual reason and lull people into a false sense of security? Do you see this, Scott, as a potential threat, and the idea of saying they ought to be on the no-fly list in general, not just an airline specific, but you can't take to any skies?
Yeah, I am skeptical of this because I think there's a huge difference between people who put their hands on other people, commit violence, some of the things flight attendants are reporting where people are actually getting physical with them. I absolutely think that would qualify you to be prosecuted and then put on a no-fly list. But when you start to then define down other interactions, such as a heated conversation or a misunderstanding that becomes a heated conversation, I worry that certain people could be defined as, no-fly list worthy when it was nothing more than a heated interaction. So I think the definition would be critical. Now, I will tell you, the way to end all of this and the way to make all of this go away is for the FAA to end the stupid mask mandate on airplanes right now. We do not need mask mandates on airplanes. It is completely unnecessary. You've got Democrat governors all over the country ending mask mandates. There's not a reason in this world we need them on airplanes. When you get on an airplane, I get on a lot of them. Most everybody on there is wearing a cloth mask, which, now are pretty much called facial decorations or fashion statements. So you want to make this go away? End the mask mandate and don't put in rules that could, follow somebody around for the rest of their life when it may have been an overblown interaction.
Juliette, is it a stupid mask mandate to have them on the planes? No. Obviously, it's the prerogative of the federal government. It's the FAA. It's under the president's purview. Is it stupid?
It's a rule. I mean, and this is such a side tangent to to the issue, right? It is a rule. We can debate the rule like rational people. You cannot debate it by getting on an airplane with a mask on, because you wouldn't be allowed on without the mask on, and then pretending all of a sudden that you view this as an impediment to your freedoms. And so I want to just say where we agree. There has to be a floor of which violent behavior, unwillingness to follow the rules, to listen to flight attendants who are security officers. They're not cocktail waitresses. They are frontline security officers. That if you don't listen to them, if you don't abide by the rules, and you are violent or threatening or threaten the airplane to the extent that in a lot of these cases the airplanes are getting diverted, right? So that in and of itself is a dangerous thing in terms of moving airplanes from their flight plans. Then we agree, right? In other words, you want the bar to be high enough to violence or threat of violence. But the idea that these guys who are threatening flight attendants get to have a heckler's veto over a federal mandate rule regarding masks in a highly regulated industry is ridiculous. I'm not having this debate. I'm not going to have the masking debate.
And yet, Juliette,
right?
hold on. I hear you. Excuse me. I hear you on the debate you don't want to have, but I do, in the interest of I see you nodding, Scott, and thinking about that. When it comes down to it, this is, in fact, the debate that's happening on Capitol Hill in some respects and in different governors' offices, not because it's about whether it's stupid or not, but the debate of, and I do agree in the notion of, look, I'm not comfortable just saying, okay, let's avoid having to have a conversation about passengers who pose perhaps a deadly threat by just saying get rid of the rule. That's like saying, let's stop having conversations about terrorism by just do away with the rule about taking your shoes off before you got on an airplane. There are rules there, but unfortunately we're out of time and we'll have to leave it there with me having the last word. Sorry, Scott Jennings. Thank you so much.
Great.
I am Laura Coates and this is CNN Tonight. There's what Russia says, and then there's what Russia does, according to the White House. And tonight, there are new assessments from high up that Putin's trying to play the West for fools. According to a senior U.S. official, there is, quote, every indication, unquote, that Russia is privately mobilizing for war, while, of course, publicly offering to talk. This official tells CNN the Russian claims of pulling forces back from Ukraine and de-escalating, well, they're all false, they say, when in fact, Putin's amassed approximately 7,000 more troops at Ukraine's borders in just recent days. These new buildup estimates would now place the number of Russian forces that are circling around Ukraine at around 157,000. President Biden cited a 150,000 estimate just yesterday in his televised address. So all those videos put out by Russia's Ministry of Defense of tanks leaving Crimea and elsewhere, all that talk of troops allegedly returning to home bases. I gotta ask, was that part of a choreographed scheme by the Kremlin to make it look like Moscow's de-escalating when in fact it's doing the opposite? Because there are new satellite images that show a new bridge being built across a key river in Belarus, less than 4 miles, I might add, from the Ukrainian border, along with a new road construction. Sources believe the roads and bridge could be used by Russian forces currently in Belarus to drive to the Ukrainian capital of Kyiv. Belarus is Russia's closest international ally in the standoff. The senior Biden administration official warns to expect more false reports from Russia's state media over the few coming days, and also to watch out for Putin's public openness to diplomacy, because this official suggests that it's all perhaps a guise. But they do say the U.S. will still continue to pursue diplomacy over the coming days. So what kind of game exactly might Putin be playing? Does he realize, of course, this is the age of satellite technology where cameras and the world are watching and someone could be on to it? Or does he even care? Frankly, there are a lot of unanswered questions. It's impossible, as you know, to assess what exactly Putin wants. But both NATO and President Biden say the U.S. and allies are prepared. And part of that preparation is NATO increasing its presence in Eastern Europe to bolster allies that are neighboring Ukraine, of course, with the help of U.S. forces. More are arriving in Poland, and that's where our Nick Payton-Walsh is tonight, near that very border with Ukraine. Nick, I'm glad you're there. What are you seeing on the ground? And really, my first question, above all else, is it happening or isn't it? There is these sort of tale of two countries and what's being told. What are you seeing?
Well, certainly in terms of what the signals are of what's been happening around Ukraine on its eastern flank, where Russian troops are, it is very hard to divine precisely whether we're beginning to see a de-escalation or, as we heard very emphatically from the White House, from the US Secretary of State, from UK officials, from the NATO Secretary General, that we are in fact seeing a slow continued mobilization. You mentioned the figures there rising by 7,000 up from the 150,000 President Joe Biden mentioned yesterday. It may be that it takes a number of days for President Putin's suggestion of withdrawal to come into effect, but you have to remember over the past 10, 20 years, we've seen in other conflicts Russia talking peace while advancing its military position on the ground. That may be what we're seeing here, and it's consistent with the Russian idea of kind of maskirovka, of hiding what your true intentions are. Here, though, in Poland, on the other western side of Ukraine today, at the airport not far from where I'm standing in Rzeszów, we saw hundreds of US troops coming in from the 82nd Airborne, from Fort Bragg, large passenger aircraft, Black Hawks in accompaniment too. It's Cessna light aircraft, it seemed, bringing in some of the top brass, trucks, pallets, a lot of equipment being moved in. This is no small measure we're seeing here. It is essentially, we're told, a just-in-case measure, in case they are required to help US citizens inside of Ukraine get out of that country if there is a conflict. But you can see resources here that seem to suggest the potential for a wider mission as well. We saw a tent encampment where the 82nd were essentially going to live, but also nearby larger white tents being erected too, perhaps for some more extensive operation here. This is not symbolic. Clearly, the strength of forces here shows they feel they may have to actually do something at some point in the weeks ahead, although I'm sure the abiding sentiment is they'd much rather find themselves bored and cold under canvas here doing little. But it is stark, frankly, Laura, to having seen over the years NATO practicing drills, military maneuvers like this because of their concerns on the eastern flank since Russia moved into Crimea in 2014, to see it now actually occur in reality on the ground here because of a perceived actual threat. Startling in Europe 2022, Laura.
Absolutely. Nick Peyton Walsh, thank you so much for your excellent reporting as always. And as he said, I mean, there's news of yet another 7,000 Russian troops that are arriving at the Ukrainian border. And this comes as a Ukrainian intelligence report obtained exclusively by CNN says the number of Russian forces remains still insufficient for a full-scale invasion. Let's discuss now the military options that Vladimir Putin has with retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. Colonel, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here to help us try to understand this. And the initial question, of course, for everyone, as Nick was talking about, look, is Putin the great provocateur, or is this gamesmanship that puts us all at the brink?
Yeah, without question, it's gamesmanship, but with very decidedly deadly potential consequences. And look, this is something we got to understand right up front, and it's a stone cold reality that everybody needs to come to grips with, especially in Washington, and that is that Ukraine does not matter to American national security, but avoiding nuclear war with Russia does. And that's the reason why you've seen President Biden absolutely take off the table. There's no possibility he's going to send U.S. troops in to fight Russia on behalf of Ukraine. NATO has said that they're not going to. So it's clear that if there's an invasion, Ukraine is on their own. Now, if we understand that, then we have to come to ask the question, if Ukraine membership in NATO is what's absolutely driving Putin, and it is, he's been saying that literally since 2007, then we have to say, why should we keep saying the door's going to be open when we are never going to allow Ukraine in NATO? There's no way they would come in. We don't even want them in. So let's don't keep that door open if it's going to get Ukraine invaded. I
understand that, but isn't that part of the gamesmanship that Putin may be playing, right? The idea that if Ukraine is always perceived as a permanent liability where it triggers the affirmative obligation to then act and support as if they're a NATO ally, then it's in Putin's interest to continue the gamesmanship, to put the constant threat as sort of Damocles over them. But is that part of the thought here, or is it also equal parts perhaps emotional? I mean, we can't always read into the tea leaves, but is Putin saying, no, the reason is also Ukraine should belong to me?
Well, he actually doesn't want it to belong to him. He just wants to make sure it doesn't belong to NATO, which is why just a couple of days ago when the Ukrainian ambassador just floated the idea that, well, maybe we should take our request for NATO off the table. And then Zelensky actually echoed it at some number of hours later. The Kremlin immediately jumped on that and said, yes, that is a great idea. That could definitely de-escalate things and something we would like to proceed and talk about.
Let me ask you, though, on de-escalation, how are we supposed to know? I mean, I know not me sitting here and you sitting here at this table, but is there some sort of warning? And the idea of how will the United States know that we are no longer in the reactive? Are we sitting ducks waiting for every sort of chess piece to be made by Putin? Are we going to have some understanding of, do they have everything in place to accomplish this? I mean, the troop numbers still very substantial. Is it enough?
Yeah, I'm telling you, as one who has engaged in direct combat with tanks and armored vehicles, they absolutely have enough combat power to slice Ukraine in half and do whatever they want to,
Really?
especially in the eastern part. There is no doubt. It is, and of course, it's growing by the day. So we have to take these dispositions very seriously. And to your point earlier about, is he's Putin saying one thing, but then he's doing another. We have to look at what he's doing. Forget about what he's saying. We have to look at the type of forces, their physical location, and the fact that they are ready for action. And I have been in that situation before. And once you get ready for action, it's hard to pull it back down, which is why we need to de-escalate the situation and just acknowledge reality and take NATO membership off the table for Ukraine.
But let me ask, I mean, at what cost to Russia? I mean, the idea of being able to accomplish, as you say, turn it in half, it feels as though you're talking about perhaps maybe of a kamikaze type of situation here. Do they have the ability to pull it off and at no great risk or cost to Russia? Because obviously, I'm sure Putin is thinking about the ability to do it versus what cost it would be in the long run. And of course, we know that you have American troops, at least, in positions to actually bolster the NATO allies. So what is the cost to Russia if they do this?
Yeah, well, I'm telling you, all these troops that are in Poland and elsewhere, Russia's not even threatening to do anything into NATO. So those troops have no impact on Putin's calculation here. They're literally inconsequential. But the other thing that we like to talk about is all these, catastrophic sanctions and everything else, all this pain it would cause. Well, the problem is that's a double-edged sword. And I can assure you there's many countries in Europe, Germany being one of the leading ones, that are not excited about that because it will harm their economy. I mean, 50% of their daily gas supplies come from Russia. And if Russia decides to turn it off because they get sanctioned, what's Germany going to do? It's going to decimate their economic output because they literally won't have enough gas to keep the electricity on. So we have to be careful that we don't hurt our own self over something that we're never going to do anyway. We are never going to bring Ukraine into NATO.
So in that respect, I mean, the fact you heard just yesterday, I mean, President Biden was speaking, but he was speaking as commander-in-chief at this point in time, also top diplomat in many respects. Is the White House doing what they need to do, taking consideration what you've just articulated, the idea of it being a fool's errand to have them enter into NATO? Are they doing enough or the right course of action?
I don't think so. I think that we are stuck in a Cold War mentality where we get to call all the shots as we have since 1991. And the balance of power is now come back to something near equilibrium. We don't have the luxury to just tell Russia what we're going to do anymore. And if we keep trying to push that line, we're going to get Ukraine invaded unnecessarily because this can be pulled down and not even happen, or at least a good chance for it not to happen. But if we press forward this and just say, no, we're not going to let Putin tell us what to do, most likely Ukraine is going to pay in blood for that decision.
I mean, this can never be just about chest beating, right? This can't be about bravado. There's so many things at stake. And
It
this should
shouldn't
really be a humanitarian. It shouldn't be, right? But we also know the history of the world. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Colonel. Nice talking to you.
My pleasure. Thanks for.
Federal prosecutors presented more damning evidence today to show that the 3 white men who killed Ahmaud Arbery did so because of racial animus. An FBI intelligence analyst led the jury through a litany, and I do mean a litany, of racist text messages and social media posts, particularly from 2 of them. And honestly, I'm going to be honest with you here, it's too sickening to read all of them and the vitriol. But this is just a sliver so you can understand what the jury is hearing. In one text message by Travis McMichael, remember he's the one who actually shot Ahmaud Arbery, in a text he sent to a friend on why he liked his new job, he said it was because he didn't work with black people. Quote, they ruin everything. That's why I love what I do now. Not an N-word in sight, unquote. In another instance, he responded to a video where a black man put barbecue sauce on a white man's head as a prank, responding, I'd kill that effing N-word. He repeatedly described Black people as monkeys and savages, and even commented under a video of Black Lives Matter protests that he wished for a semi-automatic gun to shoot them. Meanwhile, his daddy shared racist memes, claiming in one of them that white Irish slaves were treated worse than any other race in the U.S., but that they aren't asking for handouts. Their accomplice, William Roddy Bryan, the neighbor, you remember, he regularly used slurs and mocked Martin Luther King Day, at one point referencing it as a monkey parade. I want to bring in CNN legal analyst Joey Jackson, and I do repeat, that was but a sliver. Joey, in the grand endeavor to pursue justice in the form of a hate crime, they're off to a heck of a start from the prosecution. Do you think so?
Yeah, without question, Laura. Always good to see you and be with you. Look, the bottom line here is that I know that you have to make the connection, right, between the prior comments and statements and beliefs and values of the defendants to this particular case. But you know, that, to your point, is a pretty good start when you're talking about the things that you believe. And so, yes, you can make the argument, as the defense is here, Laura, that, hey, my clients may have said these things in the past, they may have espoused all of these values, et cetera, but look the other way, because that's not the basis or reason and that they charged and ran after and hunted down and shot and killed Ahmaud Arbery. That had nothing to do with it. And so the defense is trying to disconnect the two and saying that the defendants had a good faith belief. They were protecting the neighborhood. They thought Ahmaud Arbery was doing something that was amiss or illegal. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the basis for what they're doing. But it's hard to make that argument when you read all the ugly things that you read, when it looks and sounds and quacks like a duck, Laura. What is it? A duck.
I got to tell you, look, I mean, you and I both know that it all comes down to the strength of a case. Things that might seem extraordinarily the shock and awe for a jury, sometimes they're the most unpredictable dozen of people you've ever seen in your life. They don't always make the connection. Let's talk about that composition of the jury, though. I think it's important to show the audience about how it is comprised and the race of the different jurors that as we now know it. We know in the state trial, it was 11 white jurors, 1 black judge, 3 whites were alternates. And of course, a lot was made about the idea of would they be able to connect the dots in light of the defense counsel statement in the homicide. At the federal trial, you have a more diverse, it seems, jury at pool here, 8 white people, 3 blacks, 1 Hispanic. In terms of how a jury might receive this information, Joey, what do you think is the way that these prosecutors have to approach the scenario? Because if you're talking about the element of having to prove the racial animus, it's not enough just to prove, for example, that somebody generally has these viewpoints. They've got to show that it was the reason why they acted. Will either or any of these 3 take the stand, you think, in defense of their actions? At least at the state trial, the shooter did.
Yeah, so excellent points, Laura, right? So to unpack that, number one, jurors, if you look at the state case where it was a lot less diverse, what did they do, right? In the Deep South, they convicted. Now, we know the issues were different. It was not about race. It was about whether they killed Ahmaud Arbery and whether or not they kidnapped and confined him and whether or not they engaged in those activities, nothing relating to race, right? You could make those inferences. This case is all about that. Now, with respect to a composition of the jury, you've tried a lot of cases successfully as the stellar prosecutor that you were. And you know, just like I know from the defense perspective, that you're picking people. And people, you know, you want to be fair-minded in the people you pick. You want them to be impartial. And there are some people who could be African-American who may not espouse the same views as African-Americans. That could be white jurors who are more sympathetic to African-Americans, et cetera. So you have to evaluate the jury for who they are, not particularly what they look like. That's why we're here in the first place, you can argue. But I do think that the defendants have a lot of explaining to do. When you asked about the issue, will they testify, you have to look and evaluate, why did you say those things in the past? And how can we believe as jurors that they're not connected to this case? And why don't they represent who you are? And when you look at the father and the son, you know and I know that you can make reasonable inferences from the evidence. No one's born a racist. That is taught behavior. Tell me who you're eating dinner with. Tell me who's raising you. Tell me what they're talking to you about, and I'll tell you who you are because it's based on who you taught. So you can't tell me that the son believes all these things, but the father, because his cell phone was encrypted and we don't have that much from him, maybe he believes something else. And so I think at the end of the day, they may very well testify because they have to tell that jury that, you know what I did wasn't based on race. It was based on my good faith belief that he was doing something to the neighborhood. It's a very tough argument to make, Laura.